Hello Mishbucha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother. Welcome back to my channel. I'm here today with a standalone review of Richard Wright's newly published but previously unpublished novel or novella, The Man Who Lived Underground. So this book was published last month by Library of America. It contains the contents of the novella, The Man Who Lived Underground. It also has an accompanying essay that Richard Wright wrote specifically to go with this novel, which is called Memories of My Grandmother, and then it also has an afterword written by Malcolm Wright, who is Richard Wright's grandson. So this review will not contain spoilers. I'm just going to be telling you essentially the basic premise of the book, which you could get from just reading the jacket. I will, however, be delving into some topics that Richard Wright discusses in the essay Memories of My Grandmother, so I guess if you don't want to be spoiled for the essay, don't watch this, but otherwise I'm not going to spoil anything that happens in the actual novella itself. So anyway, so the plot of the novel is essentially that we are first introduced to Fred Daniels, who's a fairly young working class black man. He has just finished working at his employer's house and he's been paid by them, and he has left their home and he's standing on the street counting his money. And you know, pretty much as soon as we see him doing that, he is accosted by 3 police officers who take him into their custody for some kind of crime. And he is sort of, you know, unbelieving that this is even happening, incredulous rather. And so then they take him to the police station. He figures out that he's being accused of murdering the neighbors of his employers, which he did not do. And so anyway, so he keeps sort of trying to explain how he didn't do this, and you know, the policeman should just go talk to his employers or talk to, you know, the reverend of his church or any number of other, or his pregnant wife or any number of other people, right? But they are just insistent that, you know, this is the guy, and they beat him quite severely in fairly graphic detail, to the point where he is coerced into signing a confession. And then at some point after that, he manages to escape their custody, and goes to hide out literally underground, as implied by the title, in the sewers. And it's there that the story really takes off, because while he is underground, he sort of is able to see life from the outside as an outside observer, and he comes to some realizations about the world around him, particularly concerning the sort of superficial material nature of the world, and also the interconnectedness of all people and things. So that's really the premise of the novel. And I have to say, after I first finished reading the novella part, before I got into the accompanying essay Memories of My Grandmother, I was kind of like, because it didn't seem like Fred Daniels was a terribly well-developed character. I mean, we're just introduced to him, like literally within like, you know, 2 to 3 pages of us being introduced to him, he's arrested and taken into custody by these racist police officers who beat the hell out of him. So we don't really get a chance to get any understanding of who he was as a person prior to this happening, and so I feel like some of the choices that he then makes and things that he thinks later on, for me, because I am such a sort of character-driven reader, don't necessarily make sense, because I don't have anything to compare it with before all this stuff happened to him. So in that sense, it was a little confusing. And it was also confusing because I am familiar with Wright from his naturalistic works, like Native Son and like the stories in Uncle Tom's Children. So literary naturalism is really concerned with environment, and specifically the effects of the environment on characters in a story, and oftentimes characters in naturalistic stories will not be able to change their fates because their destinies have been more or less preordained by the environments which they inhabit. And Native Son is probably the prime example of Wright's literary naturalism. So I was kind of expecting something like that. Naturalism is heavily based in realism, but this novel is sort of part realism, but part metaphor or allegory. And so I think because I was expecting naturalism, I didn't quite understand, I didn't quite know what to make of this when I got to the end. The other reason why is because the manuscript in some places feels sort of unfinished, because initially when Wright wrote this manuscript, which was after the publication of Native Son in 1940, he then wrote the novel-length version of The Man Who Lived Underground between 1941 and 1942. It was rejected by the publisher that he tried to submit it to, and after that he shelved it, and I don't think he ever came back to it. And so I wasn't sure if the parts of it that felt unfinished were because he intended to go back later and work on it some more, or, you know, what the deal was. But he does explain more in the accompanying essay, Memories of My Grandmother, what it is that he was trying to do and explore here. And you might wonder, why is it titled Memories of My Grandmother? I mean, this is about a black man who, you know, suffers from police brutality and then is sort of forced to escape underground. So where does the grandmother fit in, right? So Richard Wright was raised for a decent portion of his life by his very religious Seventh-day Adventist grandmother, who was a woman who, even though she lived in the world, tried to keep the world, the secular world, at as much distance from her as possible. She rarely engaged with the secular world. She would not allow Wright to read any books other than the Bible. No one sang songs in her house unless they were church hymns, etc., etc. And so she was very rigid and devout in her faith, to the point that it was like an all-encompassing frame, all-encompassing force that basically framed her entire existence, to the point that she almost like did not recognize the world for what it actually was, because she was so focused on her religious faith and so averse to engaging with the world as it was. And so Wright wanted to write about the Black experience, but also about his grandmother's religiosity, and this novella was a way for him to kind of do both at the same time. So in Fred Daniels' journey underground, and the things that he sort of sees from the outside as an outside observer are both an indication of the ways in which African Americans are sort of outsiders to the United States and American culture, but also a demonstration of the ways in which Fred Daniels is at that point in the world, but he's not of the world, because he's looking at it from the outside, and all of his experiences are filtered through this experience of living underground, which is, you know, not what the vast majority of people are doing, in the same way that Richard Wright's grandmother filtered all of her experiences through her religious faith, even though that's not how the world actually objectively was, if that makes sense. Wright also, in this essay, Memories of My Grandmother, talks about this novella as a sort of surrealist piece of writing. And he talks some about his influence by Gertrude Stein and Three Lives, and specifically her story in Three Lives of Melanchthon. That was quite interesting to me, because I've read Three Lives several times and studied it fairly extensively, because I wrote about it in my dissertation, so I was quite interested in that portion of the essay. And then he also talks about this book as an improvisational piece of jazz prose writing. And so he said that this is the book that flowed most from sheer inspiration than anything else he ever wrote. And it is the book that sort of flowed most naturally, so he kind of just let the story take him where it wanted to go, more or less. And so while I was reading the novella portion, there were parts of it that didn't necessarily make sense to me. I wasn't exactly sure how things were happening logically, but I think that's because it was written very sort of, like it was sketched out, because it was written very improvisationally and as a sort of form of jazz writing, rather than, again, a kind of literary naturalism that I was used to from Wright. So things aren't necessarily supposed to make complete, total logical sense. So I think that that's a useful thing to know going into this book, so you have a greater appreciation, again, of what it is that Wright is doing here Because yeah, I think it actually might have been more useful to me to read the essay, to read the Memories of My Grandmother essay before I read the novella, and then I think I probably would have appreciated it more, rather than reading the novella and then the essay and being like, ah, that's what was happening this whole time. So anyway, so there's also an afterword by Malcolm Wright, Richard Wright's grandson, where he talks about this novel as a kind of inversion of Plato's allegory of the cave, which I totally see, and I think that's definitely a useful way to look at this as well. I have read a few reviews of this book on Goodreads that I think kind of stop at a surface level examination of it. They kind of stop with the police brutality that we see at the beginning, and they're like, oh, this book is so timely. And yeah, it is timely in that sense, but it also would have been timely at the time Richard Wright wrote it. It would have been timely before he wrote it, and it would have been timely at any point after he wrote it as well. So I feel like that kind of misses some of the larger things that Wright is trying to do here that he talks about in the essay, Memories of My Grandmother. I did read 2 reviews of this book elsewhere that I thought were quite good that I will link down below. One was by Colin Asher in the New Republic, and the other one was by Imani Perry in the Atlantic. So anyway, so I'm glad that I read this. I think it is a good, useful addition to the canon, and it definitely, I think, adds something to Wright's body of work that we hadn't necessarily previously seen from him. So I think that's useful in our understanding of who Wright was as a writer as well. So if you've read this book, or you are interested in reading it or have thoughts about it, I would love to hear that. Please feel free to let me know that down in the comments below. Thank you for watching this. I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope you're doing good reading whatever you're reading, and until next time, would it kill you to call you mother?